All right, aloha everyone. Welcome to this month's third Thursday. We have an exciting presentation coming up for you. But before we get started, I want to tell you about some brief instructions for the Zoom. If you have any questions, hold on to your questions until the end of the presentation. Please keep your microphones off at all times during the presentation. And for our next month's third Thursday, it will be held on October 17th. And the topic will be on artificial intelligence, helping or harming emergency management. So keep your emails open, keep your emails intact. We'll have that information to you in a few weeks. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Roberto Porro, who is currently an emergency management specialist in the Community Infrastructure Resilience Branch under the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division under the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Roberto or Rob used to be at NDPTC both as a student and also as a staff at NDPTC before he moved to Puerto Rico, and we're super excited to have him here today to talk about his PhD dissertation. Rob, I'll hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kung. And aloha, good afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are. Evening for me. Thanks, Kung, for that introduction. As he mentioned, my name is Rob Porro. I am currently working for FEMA in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division in the Community Infrastructure Resilience Branch. You don't know what that is. Our branch focuses on helping to implement the public assistance mitigation program. So getting mitigation through the public assistance program, broadly speaking, just helping to ensure that recovery is done more resiliently. All that being said, I'm not presenting today as a FEMA employee. I'm taking my FEMA hat off. It is after 5 here. And I'm presenting as a friend and alumni of NDPTC and the University of Hawaii. So I'm going to go ahead and cover that part of my title just to avoid any headaches down the road. But it's great to be back with NDPTC, seeing some familiar faces and some names on the participant list. As Kung mentioned, I do live in Puerto Rico now, another beautiful island, but I do miss Oahu and I miss Hawaii, so I'm really glad to be back with some former NDPTC colleagues and Hawaii colleagues, at least virtually. So for this third Thursday, I'm going to be presenting on my PhD research. I was a PhD student of Carl Kim's, the director of NDPTC. For a while, I completed my PhD while at NDPTC when I was serving as the coastal program manager. And so the research kind of fed into some of NDPTC's courses, specifically the coastal hazards courses. And so the research was completed last year. And so just trying to get the message out on terms of the findings and the messages as much as I can since then. The research focused on coastal adaptation in island communities and specifically the role that planning, both plans and planning capacity, as the title implies, the role that they play in adaptation on islands. And so it explored that role through basically a plan or planning evaluation. For my own curiosity, I'm going to start with a poll, or not an actual poll, but maybe a question to the audience. Maybe you could raise your hand or whatever the feature is in Zoom. Who is on the call? Who's joining from an island? All right, seeing a lot of hands go up. Yeah. All right, good to know. Yeah, it's not a surprise that there's quite a few hands up, given that this is a University of Hawaii event, but I also see that there's a lot of folks that didn't raise their hands. So Good to know that as well. I focus on islands because, disclosure, I'm not from an island, but having worked and lived on islands for many years, my heart is on islands. And from an urban planning perspective, what I studied and what my background is in, I've realized that islands are different, and they're challenging in terms of planning for climate change and resilience. Not all those challenges are necessarily unmet. I think there's a lot of strengths in islands, which I'll get to, but they are different than other places. And so I think there's value in conveying that message and sharing that message that to those that are not on islands, so they understand kind of the differences, the uniqueness, the challenges, and experiences when it comes to adaptation on islands. Because ultimately, I think adaptation is it is a learning process, and I think there's a lot to learn from other places. And so what I'll cover today, I'll try to spend about 45 minutes covering really quickly the context, kind of the overview of some of the known challenges with adaptation, especially along the coast, the purpose of the research, which was to evaluate coastal adaptation and processes across islands. I'll describe the framework that I developed to evaluate coastal adaptation planning, how that framework was applied through two separate but complementary studies, and then I'll finish up with some takeaways, opportunities, and recommendations, essentially the so what of this work. Considering, I'm assuming there's probably some planning students either with NDPTC or the University of Hawaii on the line. So I will touch on some of the research elements, the research design that might be helpful to current planning students. But again, I'm definitely want to get to the so what for those practitioners. I will try to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion at the end. Feel free to pop in questions into the chat. I may or may not see them while I'm presenting, but we'll try to get to them at the end if we can. And if not, I could answer them separately or after the call. So again, this project was part of my PhD dissertation work, PhD in urban planning at the University of Hawaii. Again, I did it while I was with NDPTC, so it did inform some of the training courses. Also, a lot of the research design and interviews were conducted when I was completing a one-year Sea Grant Canals Fellowship in Washington, D.C., where I was working with the Coastal States Organization and FEMA. And so definitely need to give a big thanks to all of these organizations for allowing me to integrate this into that work and allowing me access to their networks and ideas to make this research better. And an extra big thanks to those that contributed to the research through interviews, which I'll describe a bit later. In case any of them are on the call, thank you. I do hope that this is helpful in some way. All right, so diving into the project. So the motivation for this work is really the tension that I've come to see along that land-sea boundary or the shoreline, having seen firsthand the results of trying to create a fixed boundary in what is a dynamic and powerful natural environment. And so that tension becomes very visible oftentimes, as you can see in these photos. And it's fueled by increasing development of housing and infrastructure along the coast, which leads to environmental degradation and loss of those ecosystem services that those ecosystems provide. And then on top of that, you have climate change, which, as we know, means sea level rise and increased intensity of storms, saltwater intrusion, and the like for coastal areas. Combined, these factors result in increasing coastal erosion, flooding, damage to property and infrastructure, accelerated loss of beaches and ecosystems, often due to the measures that we take to protect development against those other impacts. And so addressing that problem I think comes down to these several key efforts, all of which I think plans and planning have a critical role. Managing growth and development, mitigating risk from chronic and episodic hazards, managing natural resources, dealing with uncertainty. All of these, I think, are challenging anywhere, but I think they could be especially challenging on islands where land is limited. The topography can be constraining in terms of where you can develop. Natural resources are important to culture and the economy and livelihoods, and where hazards are literally coming from all sides. On top of that, you have the isolation and the distance between you and other jurisdictions. So that also presents a challenge. And so I grounded my work on these three fields that have examined different parts of this problem, but also have some overlap in terms of the objectives and the research direction. And they are coastal management or coastal zone management, climate adaptation, and planning, or more specifically, plan evaluation. In each of these fields, there's been a trend towards this concept of integration, or integrating the objectives of the fields across a variety of community sectors or planning mechanisms. And although there is some overlap and progress in a known kind of direction, there's always gaps and opportunities for future research. So looking at those gaps in the literature led me to identify a need for research that focuses on the planning versus the programmatic side of coastal zone management and adaptation. Research that uses multiple methods to look at not only plans or planning products, but also planning processes. And then lastly, research, especially plan evaluation research, that focuses on the specific planning challenges of islands, since much of the plan evaluation research comes from the continental US. And so all of that kind of led me to these three research questions. One, what are the principles that should guide coastal adaptation planning in general? And that kind of sets the stage for the other two questions, which are, how well do island jurisdictions' plans integrate these principles? And then what are the challenges for coastal adaptation across islands and the capacities needed to overcome them? So looking at that first question, to answer it, I drew from the coastal management and adaptation literature to identify the criteria or characteristics of what the academic research considers good or sound coastal management and adaptation, principles that each of these fields are striving for. So you can see on the screen, they're slightly similar. They're based on similar concepts like adaptive management, ecosystem-based management, sustainable development, all terms that you may be familiar with or even practicing, with adaptation having some additional considerations related to climate change, like longer time horizons or dealing with uncertainty of climate science and things like that. But as you start to combine them, a set of characteristics or criteria emerge, which could serve as a framework for looking at coastal adaptation. And so taking these principles and tailoring them to planning kind of comes up with a set of these coastal adaptation planning principles. They include adaptation intelligence or information, inclusive planning, integrated planning, vulnerability reduction, nature-based adaptation, and adaptive planning. I kind of considered these principles as either being informative or like informative in that they form the knowledge base to inform the plan, or responsive, responding to that knowledge or hazard risk or public input. Excuse me. Okay. Oh no. The line between them, if you can see on the slide, is dashed because I do recognize that there's elements of each of these that could be either informative or responsive. But this is one way I decided to organize these principles for the purposes of the research and the analysis. And it also ties back to, especially for the planners in the audience, this common definition of planning that we hear, of planning being knowledge to action. So these categories kind of align with that. These principles were essentially the lens that I looked through. Another part of the framework is what you're looking at. And so in this case is the planning products or plans, the planning processes, and the context in which planning takes place. And so I applied that framework to look at planning in U.S. island jurisdictions, so specifically American Samoa, Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, so both in the Pacific and Caribbean regions. The research consisted, as I mentioned earlier, these two kind of could stand alone studies, but they're meant to complement each other. And the first one is a quantitative plan evaluation, so looking at the plans themselves, which leverages some established methods to do that, and looking at the plans against those principles. And then the second one, which I'll describe a little bit later, is kind of more a broader planning evaluation, looking at kind of processes and context through interviews. But I'll start by describing that first study. And so, as I mentioned, there is a kind of this well-established method in the planning literature to evaluate plans based on a set of principles or criteria. And so that method typically includes these steps here on the screen, which include compiling an inventory of relevant plans, essentially identifying the sample, identifying indicators for each of the principles and developing a coding protocol for each indicator, and then reviewing the plans and then scoring them based on that protocol. In this case, I used a 0 to 2 scale, and putting this in kind of number format allows for a quantitative analysis of the plan and which helps provide some insights into trends, gaps, priorities. In terms of the plan sample, in my case, looking across these jurisdictions, both the number and types of plans varied pretty widely across the islands, but there were two plans that were common in every place, and those were the Coastal Zone Management Act, Section 309 Assessment and Strategy, which is a NOAA-driven plan, usually put together by state or territory coastal management programs. And then the other one was the State or Territory Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is a FEMA-driven plan, usually developed by the state or managed by the State or Territory Emergency Management Agency. And you can see on the screen some kind of other details or characteristics of the plan. But I chose to focus on these two plans because, as I said, one, they were common across all of the islands, so it did allow for some direct comparison. But second, they include similar required plan components, as you can see in the bottom half of the screen. And then lastly, since they're kind of they're overseen by these federal agencies, they are tied to funding mechanisms that could be used to implement policies or projects that could relate to adaptation. And so looking at these plans, I think helps provide some insight into how these particular federal programs can be applied or leveraged for adaptation. And so I reviewed each plan across all the jurisdictions. So it's a total of 12 plans, 2 per jurisdiction, reading the plans cover to cover, word for word. Pretty tedious process, but important for this kind of work. And so this chart shows, after all that review and scoring, this shows the mean plan scores on a 0 to 10 scale by principal. And so the gray bar is the mean score for all of the plans. And then the light blue bar is for just the hazard mitigation plans, and the dark blue bar for those 309 strategies. And so a couple of observations here. In general, you see that there is room to employ these principles more across all of the plans that I reviewed. Another observation is that the plans tend to be better at those informative principles than the responsive ones, essentially better at gathering the information than identifying strategies or actions, such as those that would be in the vulnerability reduction or nature-based adaptation principles. And this pattern of being better at the informative ones or information versus the actions, that pattern seemed to emerge throughout the data. And so looking at some of the other principles individually, this chart shows the mean plan scores for vulnerability reduction and breaks it out by the types of vulnerability reduction strategies. And so here it looks like planners are more comfortable with those planning and capacity building strategies, essentially gathering information or disseminating information than actually making the changes on the ground. And then another observation is that those land use tools that would be in the avoid or retreat category, those were less used than the more structural solutions that you would find in the protect or accommodate, which makes sense in an island setting, since you are constrained on where you can actually build. So relocating or preventing development might be more difficult. And so that pattern also emerged in the nature-based adaptation principle. So this shows the mean scores for indicators that were related to either one, nature-based information, or those that related to nature-based actions. And so again, in general, plans have information on ecosystem conditions and vulnerability, but this knowledge doesn't always translate to nature-based actions. And so with some of those results in mind, a few takeaways come up. Most evident one, again, being that in general, the plans focus on informative principles and informative indicators within principles, then on employing actions in response to that information. Another takeaway, even though it's not required in the hazard mitigation planning guidance, there does seem to be a recognition of the importance of natural systems in most of the plans. And I think this might highlight the importance of natural systems and nature in an island setting. But again, this awareness hasn't really translated into policies or projects in the plans themselves. This could be due to the guidance, the planning guidance that's associated with each of those planning programs, or just the historical focus on the built environment in hazard mitigation. And then lastly, there is room to improve meaningful participation from a wider set of stakeholders, either within or outside of government, but especially those in vulnerable communities, and especially those communities that the strategies affect directly. There's a couple things to note and to take into account with respect to the results and these takeaways that I want to point out. One, although the scores might seem kind of low, kind of like mid-range, it doesn't necessarily mean that the plan is necessarily good or bad, but more so if and how well those plans included these particular practices. And so whether or not they do could depend on a few things like data availability, capacity, priorities in that place, or even the requirements of the plan and the guidance itself. Another thing to note is that many of the plans were adopted prior to the newer policies related to nature-based solutions and equity that have been released by several federal agencies in the last few years. And so these scores may actually change in the next planning cycle. And in fact, I did this review with plans that were adopted as of, I think it was like late 2022 or something like that. So I think there are a few plans, like 2 or 3, that have been updated since then. So it'd be interesting to see, maybe continue this research when time allows, to see how these scores change over time. But those kind of considerations kind of point to the limits of looking at or using the plan itself as the object of research, and where other methods to look at processes and context may help explain some of these results. And so that leads to the second study, which again is qualitative in nature, uses interviews with practitioners, and includes a qualitative analysis of those interviews to look at the process and the context. Part of it was also to validate the plan evaluation results, but it was also to identify challenges and best practices and innovations that are happening across the islands that can be shared with other islands and other communities. So yeah, let's dive into that second study. So the interviewees, I identified folks to talk to through the NDPTC, FEMA, Coastal States Organization networks. And the main goal was to try and identify at least one coastal manager and one hazard mitigation planner in each of the 6 jurisdictions, especially those that were familiar with these 2 planning processes, but also familiar with adaptation in general in their jurisdiction and the challenges in their experiences. So I did a total of actually 13 interviews, each lasting roughly 1 hour. All but one of them were virtual over Zoom. I then transcribed those interviews and then coded the transcriptions and analyzed the results using qualitative analysis software. When I say coding, it's essentially assigning a characteristic or a code, a label, to a block of text. And so there were 3 coding cycles for this one. Ultimately, I landed on the code categories of context, planning, adaptation, challenges, and innovations. These are basically buckets that some of the comments and text from the interviews fall into. And kind of looking at each of these buckets and what people are saying related to these topics, certain kind of themes or trends emerge, and you can start to identify those and analyze them. And so there were several themes that kind of bubbled up to the surface for each of the categories. On this slide, I'm just showing the one that was most prevalent, or one that had most comments on. So for context, the most prevalent theme was that islands rely heavily on federal funding, but struggle with access and execution. So this reliance it's really driven by the fact that these particular programs, coastal management and hazard mitigation programs, often receive kind of more funding from the federal government than kind of the state or territory funding. In some cases, up to 90% of their programs funded by federal funds. And some of those funds are through competitive grants that sometimes are difficult to win since they compete with higher capacity states, as you can see in the top quote. For planning, one theme that emerged was that there's this inherent connection between coastal management, hazard mitigation, and adaptation on islands. An example of this connection is that a lot of the hazard mitigation planners that I spoke to, they all recognize the role that land use could play in adaptation and reducing risk to hazards. And then many of the land use and regulatory functions in these particular jurisdictions are led by the coastal management programs. So there's that kind of inherent connection between these, and an opportunity to align coastal management and hazard mitigation efforts for adaptation, but doesn't always happen in practice. And then lastly, for adaptation, priorities related to adaptation are driven by observed changes and impacts, with the most urgent priorities in these places being shoreline erosion and flooding. So for example, when I asked folks what their jurisdiction's priority was for adaptation, many of them quickly highlighted shoreline erosion, and they tied that kind of their priority to observations that they've seen themselves, tying it to their own personal experience and the importance of, in the case of shoreline erosion, the importance of beaches to the economy and culture. In terms of challenges, challenges get their own slide because they had a few more themes to highlight. But these are things that I heard from most, if not all, interviewees. There are challenges related to operational demands, managing public perception, managing development, and disasters. And so in terms of operational demands, this really relates to bandwidth and staffing levels, and the challenges recruiting, hiring, and retaining staff. And so because of this, those that are on staff are stretched thin and are constantly putting out fires, which prevents some of the kind of bigger picture planning and strategic planning that you could kind of see there in the quote at the top. The other challenge is managing public perception. So this requires increasing engagement and education with communities to increase the understanding of hazard risk or climate risk, but also the understanding of solutions. So as you can see in the quote, there was distrust from some communities on adaptation solutions, for example, something like retreat, because they have seen other uses take their place. And so managing that perception and that trust requires that engagement. And then that's kind of related to managing development because of the limited land, most of the islands are facing development pressures, especially higher end development along the coast. And so that staff capacity and that development pressure and politics around development make enforcement difficult. And then lastly, disasters. Unfortunately, all of the islands have experienced a declared disaster recently, sometimes multiple disasters. So on top of the trauma that might bring, it also takes bandwidth away from your kind of day-to-day functions. And then because of the pressure to recover quickly and that lack of bandwidth, sometimes recovery doesn't incorporate hazard mitigation or adaptation. And so looking at these challenges, the theme that emerges related, there's one related to capacity that comes up, and that is that there's an urgent need to increase planning capacity across the islands. And so, yes, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to adaptation, but there are some innovative things that are happening that were highlighted during the interviews, including working with nonprofits and academia for that engagement with community or for the development of plans themselves, combining planning processes to not overburden partners and stakeholders, but also to maximize the staff that you do have and maximize staff time. And then another one is strengthening grant applications, federal grant applications, leveraging other federal technical assistance programs. So using that tech assistance to make their grant applications stronger and more likely to get funding. And then lastly, leveraging comprehensive development guidance to ensure that there's alignment among plans, all of the plans on the island or in the jurisdiction. And so looking at these, another theme related to innovation comes up, which is that islands are finding innovative ways to fill capacity gaps where possible. And so the takeaways from this second study are that islands face multiple challenges, most driven by a lack of capacity. Another takeaway is that based on these challenges, island adaptation could be considered from an equity standpoint in the context of federal assistance or grants, especially relative to higher capacity states or jurisdictions. One coastal manager highlighted this in the top quote, kind of expressing their frustration with being rejected for another grant opportunity. Despite these challenges, there are examples of innovation, and if supported, these innovative practices or approaches can be upscaled and shared across islands. And that opportunity for sharing across islands was highlighted several times as being important. And so among these takeaways, I do want to highlight and explore these first two takeaways related to capacity and equity a bit more, just to drive home what they might mean for practice. And so let's start with a quick experiment. This wasn't part of my research design or anything, probably wouldn't have passed my PhD committee, but just kind of an attempt to connect dots between some of those challenges that I mentioned and getting to the so what does it mean for practice. And so I invite you to use Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, whatever your favorite search engine is. And Google, just type in map of the US and see what comes up. I'll give you just a couple seconds to do that. And I'll share what the results of mine. So use Google, and this is what came up for me. So take a look at this and take a look at your own results. And a question to you all: what do most of these maps not include? And just if you have a guess of what these maps do not include, just pop it into the chat. Guesses? Islands, territories, islands. Yes, good. Yeah, glad everyone got it. Maybe about half of the maps you see might include Hawaii and Alaska. They do share some kind of similar challenges. So maybe half of them include Hawaii. None of these, at least in my search results, included any of the island territories. So think about that. If you don't see them on a map, if you don't see a place on a map, you can kind of imagine that it could be harder to keep in mind the unique kind of struggles of these places, right? If they're not even on the map. And so what are some of those struggles? Let's dive into that a little bit more. First off, as I mentioned, every one of these jurisdictions have experienced a major disaster, meaning they've had a federal disaster declaration, but sometimes for major events that you've probably heard of recently. That's to say nothing of kind of the smaller events or the chronic hazards that they're dealing with, like erosion or ecosystem loss, saltwater intrusion, things like that. But in terms of declarations, if you look at the last 20 years, it does seem that the risk is increasing. I haven't done any rigorous statistical analysis on this, but just looking at the numbers. So in the last 20 years, there was 120 declarations in those last 20 years. 52 of those, or almost half of those, happened in just the last 5. So yeah, it does seem like the risk is increasing. All of them, with maybe the exception of Hawaii, are also experiencing a shrinking population. Part of this is driven by those disasters, which is an example of climate migration. But this leads to less government revenue from taxes and also brain drain or loss of expertise as people move off the island to somewhere else, typically the continent. Another reason populations may be shrinking besides disasters is the cost of living. For those that live on an island, you know this, islands are expensive. And that's obviously due to shipping costs, which is driven by that distance, and the Jones Act, which could be a separate topic. But all of that makes food, construction materials, household goods, all of that more expensive. And sadly, most of the islands do import most of that, especially the food. Another aspect of kind of the high cost of living is high housing prices. If you've looked at the real estate market in Hawaii or any of the other islands, you'd see that it's oftentimes higher than other places, which is driven by that limited land, which is limited supply essentially. And also the draw to these places as investment opportunities in Airbnb and things like that. So housing prices are high. And then lastly, buying power is often less because salaries tend to be lower in the islands. I've heard this characterized as the paradise tax. Essentially, employers don't have to pay as much to encourage folks to go to the islands, to this paradise. So they might pay less. I think it's also due to maybe smaller government budgets. But regardless, the lower salary, for example, like an entry-level planner position in Honolulu pays probably maybe not quite half, but around there, as much as that's the same entry-level planner position in California, for example. And so that kind of makes it difficult to retain staff, and then kind of leads back to that brain drain that I mentioned. So all of that leads to a smaller planner pool and strained resources with rising challenges. So it's easy to see how all of this would affect the capacity for adaptation. And so planning capacity is a key driver here. Capacity of communities it's often used as a measure for framing equity and directing adaptation investments. And so it's hard to argue that island adaptation is not an equity issue when you're thinking about capacity, especially relative to places on the continent. And again, this is driven by capacity, and I've mentioned that a few times, so I do want to dive into that a little bit more. Many of the risk or vulnerability indices, they often conflate capacity of a community with vulnerability or measure of vulnerability, like median household income, things like that. Rarely do they include indicators that are related directly to planning capacity, like number of staff, government budgets, expertise, etc. There was a study recently by Headwaters Economics that created a rural capacity index. In fact, rural communities may share a lot of these same challenges as islands in terms of capacity. But they did include an indicator related to local and state government capacity in the index. Fortunately, the study did not include territories, but it did include Hawaii, which they scored as number 11 of the states that are below the national median of capacity. So essentially, they ranked 39th. And so thinking about this capacity, it kind of becomes clear, especially when you think about bandwidth, demands of the job, time and staff needed for engagement, enforcement, protecting resources. Capacity could have this like self-reinforcing or feedback effect, and especially a relationship with risk. And so depending on where you start in terms of planning capacity, this could be either an adaptation accelerator, moving you into this upper left quadrant, or it could be, if you start lower planning capacity, it could be this kind of growing hurdle for adaptation planning, moving you towards the right quadrant. And so this is definitely an idealized or simplified version of reality, but it highlights the effect that capacity can have both positively and negatively, and the importance of investing in capacity upfront. It's not all doom and gloom. Capacity it's not something that's inherent. It's a result of various factors, some of which could be changed. And also there are innovations that are happening, but there's both the plan evaluation and the interviews point to some potential leverage points for planning across the islands. The first being island networks, both within and across the island. So generally kind of smaller geographies with closer professional or social networks, islands can leverage that to improve alignment across sectors and participation for planning processes. Given the value that's placed on nature and the ecosystems and the ecosystem services that exist in the islands, these could be powerful for adaptation, and that value that's placed on them could help getting buy-in for nature-based solutions. And then lastly, disaster recovery. Obviously, there's a lot of funding that comes in the case of declared disasters. And so that funding and processes related to recovery can be leveraged for adaptation. Those leverage points and the challenges that I discussed, they all lead to this set of recommendations, both for planners and federal partners, or even big NGOs that operate either nationally or regionally. This isn't to say that these aren't happening on some level, but more so if you're doing them, keep doing them or expand them. And if you're not, then consider these recommendations. So for island planners, expand the tool set. So consider those land use solutions or nature-based solutions. Think beyond the structural solutions for hazard mitigation or adaptation. The second is combining planning processes to gain efficiency and to maximize staff and engagement opportunities with communities. So you're not overburdening them with engagement if each planning sector is doing some type of public participation event. Another is planning before a disaster, again, to maximize those, leverage those funding opportunities that come with recovery. And then lastly, look to external partners and potential resources to fill those capacity gaps, whether it's for engagement or even developing the plan. On the federal partner NGO side, a big one is coordinating planning programs. So thinking about the requirements for these planning processes and thinking of ways to maybe align them, look for opportunities to kind of coordinate across the two sectors, facilitate cross-sector coordination. So there's coordination needed at the federal level, but also the federal government and agencies and NGOs can play kind of a convening or coordinating role for state or territory level coordination across sectors within those governments. The second one being thinking about designing or updating programs to consider capacity challenges, rethink where islands fit in the equity conversation, and rethink how capacity is considered in existing programs. And then another one is increasing technical assistance opportunities, helping to fill those capacity gaps, making that type of assistance more accessible. And then lastly, facilitating cross-island collaboration and knowledge exchange. And this is, again, I think an important role that federal agencies and these national NGOs could play. All right, and so to conclude, I see conclusions kind of related to either the research and or to practice. And so the research outcomes, those are the immediate results and the contribution of the project to the body of planning research. And in this case, contributions include a tested evaluation method, which can be modified or tailored for research or for practice. And then the other contributions is that knowledge base that it helps build, identifying the planning status and challenges across islands. For practice, it kind of ties back to those recommendations and thinking about ways to address some of the challenges and capacity gaps. Part of that is rethinking how islands are viewed in terms of equity relative to the continent, and also leveraging opportunities for aligning plans and processes and sharing knowledge across islands. And I think this sharing knowledge piece is particularly important, and it's highlighted pretty well, perfectly in this quote from a hazard mitigation planner. I just want to know and feel the confidence that I'm not alone on this dirt road, and knowing that other people are having those type of issues gives me that confidence. And so this really highlights that sharing knowledge across islands is important. And again, I think federal agencies and NGOs can play a big role in creating those opportunities. But also going back to my original message, I also think that sharing knowledge, or specifically, again, conveying the message of the uniqueness of islands and the challenges they face to others is important as well, to understand the struggles and the strengths in the islands. And my hope is that this work helps to convey that message. So with that, to say thank you in all the languages that we'd hear across all the islands, and happy to take any questions. Looks like we have a little bit of time left.
Thank you, Rob. That was an excellent presentation. And I really valued what you said about capacity, especially as an island setting. Our plans don't emphasize a lot of that capacity that's needed to increase resilience for our islands, and then we're forced to be creative and find gaps to fill that capacity itself, which entails building relationships with each other. But it gets harder as we get more into threatening situations as climate change increases. So it's kind of like both situations. We have to understand how to deal with that in the future.
Yeah,
and
that's a good point. Dolan, looks like your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Great presentation. Really enjoyed it. As you know, my academic interest is very much aligned with yours, and I am interested in policy evaluation, so adaptation and coastal zone management policy specifically. I'm curious, and we can talk more about this offline, but maybe for the group, I'm curious the method and the model that you've created to evaluate plans. Do you think it would be appropriate to use a similar model, or maybe your model, to evaluate policy as well? And the distinction between plans and policies is very small in my mind.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the beauty of this type of work, evaluation work, and kind of coming up with frameworks to look at a particular topic, is that it is customizable. You can modify it and tailor it to your particular questions. And so in this case, there's pieces of the framework that you may be able to use, for example, those principles. And maybe other parts of the framework won't make as much sense, like those plan evaluation methods. Although I'm sure we can dive into that a little bit and see how that could apply to policy. But yeah, those principles could be used kind of as a lens to look at policy, and the difference would be kind of the methods that you would use to identify those policies and analyze them. There could be similarities on that front as well that we could talk about.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll follow up with you later, but I'm particularly interested in the barriers. I know you touched on that, but we'll talk more about that. I'm interested in barriers to implementing policy as well. So thank you both.
Yeah, that's a great question to explore. Important. Any other questions?
I think Dolan brought up a good point, that NDPTC did a similar project with the NERS system, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, where we partnered up with them on a grant where NDPTC helped them analyze the gaps in the existing disaster response plan template. And then we've kind of created a new draft template for them to analyze further on, so that this template can be used for all the NERS systems to create their own disaster response plan.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see a question from Jacob. Do any or all of the island communities you research have individual frameworks? I'm guessing like frameworks that they use themselves to either develop or review their plans. Yes, they do. One that just comes to mind, and I don't know if there's anyone from CNMI on the line, but I had a slide that they have a smart growth guidance, and that includes some criteria or requirements for plans within the CNMI that they have to include these kind of criteria, and they do review all of the plans in the CNMI to make sure it kind of aligns with that that guidance. And so that's one example. I'm sure there's others, none come to the top of my head, but yeah, that's one example. And one worth like looking into. It's a good practice. Yeah, Lisa, see your hand up.
Hey Rob, thanks for this really interesting talk. I'm just wondering, I know you're connected with CSO and connected with things going on in DC, and I'm just wondering, we used to have a Pacific Regional Ocean Partnership between Hawaii and other Pacific Island nations and territories, and it sort of became inactive, but I'm just wondering, I know there's some other partnerships between multiple states in the US, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on if that would be beneficial for us to re-up that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not as familiar with those regional ocean partnerships. I do know CSO has a role in kind of supporting and overseeing them. But any kind of partnership like that, like it's difficult, right? Because these regions like Caribbean and Pacific, like Pacific is so big, and then it's super far away from the Caribbean, so time differences and all that is difficult to coordinate and collaborate without some kind of structure or something to help facilitate that collaboration. So any type of partnership, I think would be good. Primo, I mean, is a good example, Pacific Risk Management, Ohana. And so anything kind of like that, I think, and it would be good, and kind of either creating additional opportunities like that or really thinking of those that exist as these opportunities to collaborate, recognizing that there's not a lot of opportunities to do that either across the Pacific or across Caribbean and the Pacific. So really kind of leveraging those opportunities that do exist.
We have time for one more question, and there's a question from Nancy. If we're limited on capacity, for example, staffing, would you recommend combining CZM, hazard mitigation, and community resilience plans into one? That's a great question, Nancy. Good to see you. It's been a while. Glad you were able to join. That's a great question. So it's possible. I think it would depend on the place, right? What priorities are in that place. One thing to keep in mind is because like the CZM and hazard mitigation plans have kind of these requirements tied to federal programs, that might be more difficult to combine those two. Like the 309 has a very specific purpose. I have seen the hazard mitigation plan combined with like an adaptation plan or a resilience plan. So that is possible and has been done. But really it really depends on those federal requirements and if that would even be possible across like these different planning programs. The community resilience one is a bit easier because there's no federal resilience planning program or mandate for a resilience plan. So that one's easier to combine with a hazard mitigation plan. But that's a great question. I think combining those processes could help in that capacity standpoint, right? So like
having one engagement opportunity for both plans, at least touching on the same topics like hazards, for example, which is one of the areas for the 309 strategy. So that could be one way to do it.
I would like to thank Rob again for coming here and presenting such an incredible PhD project. Before we close up, I would like to remind everyone about our next Thursday on October 17th. It will be on artificial intelligence in emergency management. If you have any more questions for Rob, he'll put his email, his UH email, as well as his FEMA email on the screen. And be on the lookout for your email for a recording of this webinar in the next few weeks. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.